Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Authors can often be as interesting as the characters in their novels, and Lily Brooks Dalton is no exception. Writing her way onto the page first with a hip, one-of-a-kind debut with Motorcycles I've Loved, a memoir, which inspired Elle magazine to rave about a young woman of passion and velocity, Brooks Dalton has written a bright, brisk ode to her beloved two-wheelers, while Cosmopolitan mused that what the PCT is to Cheryl Strayed, the open road is to Brooks Dalton, while Us Weekly felt that her memoir about finding purpose and courage on the back of a bike is an empowering, poignant journey. She expanded that critical chorus of praise outward when she released her first fiction bestseller, Good Morning Midnight, which the Washington Post celebrated as a beautifully written, sparse post-apocalyptic novel that explores memory, loss, and identity. Fans of Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11 and Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora will appreciate the Brooks Dalton's exquisite exploration of relationships in extreme environments. The world was so moved that the film adaptation The Midnight Sky soon followed, with The Hollywood Reporter sharing on its success that directed by and starring George Clooney, the film reached Netflix's #1 spot in 77 countries, with 72 million households watching the film in its first week of release alone. More recently, she's kept readers mesmerized with The Light Pirate, where Publishers Weekly discovered upon first read that she tells a gripping story of a Florida family devastated by a hurricane, with hints of magic and a transformed landscape as the timeline stretches into the near future, promising that climate fiction aficionados will eat this up. She's with us today to talk about it all, and we couldn't be more excited. Lily, welcome to the show. How young do you first remember being enchanted with storytelling?
In terms of early authors, I always think about Madeline L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time, and that whole series. And I think I probably read almost everything she's ever written. I was really a completist with her work when I was a kid. That was the first author that I was like, oh, this person wrote this book. Like I was a reader before then, but that was the moment where it kind of clicked for me, like a single imagination created all of these different worlds. And in terms of, books as artifacts, I remember going to the public library with my mom when I was a little kid and being like magnetized by the leather bound shelf, which is like where all the Dickens and all the like fancy old English stuff was. But it was like, and so I read a lot of that stuff before I could understand what I was even reading. But to me, holding such a special book and like getting to take it home with me and getting to have this time with it is something that I've definitely never forgotten.
When did your talent first begin to glimmer off the page? Was it a grade school book report that a teacher maybe wrote an encouraging note on?
I remember, I guess it would have been like a book report or something that I was writing, and I was like trudging through, what was it? I think it was Charles Dickens' The Old Curiosity Shop. Is that what it's called? And I was like, had very little awareness of, I was just like reading it because I loved the physical object. But I was like drinking in the way that he was writing at the same time. And so I was writing this very lofty book report about something that I think was probably not lofty at all. And I think I asked my mom to spell check it for me. And she was like, this sounds like an 8-year-old trying to be Charles Dickens. What's going on? So yeah, I think a lot of writers are really porous like that, like they just kind of soak up, especially early on. Like if you're reading a really particular kind of voice, it's hard not to just suck it up like a little sponge and spit it back out. But it's part of the fun. You get to try on different voices, like different hats.
Beautifully put. Do you remember reaching a moment where you found one you felt was a natural fit for you? Whether it was short stories or essays or any lengthier forms of early writing that you did?
I went to a very small elementary school, so it was so small that the teachers would do 2 grades at the same time in the same room. So my 7th and 8th grade teacher was named Joel Howes, Mr. Howes, and he was very encouraging of how much I love to read, and would sometimes let me do like little creative writing projects instead of like the straightforward book report. I think that's right. Um, and that was really special for me to have someone encouraging me in that way. And we've stayed in touch over the years. When my last book was made into a film, I like zoomed in and spoke to his class about it, and it was really cute. I had a great professor at UMass named John Hennessy, who I've also still kept in touch with, who yeah, there was definitely, I mean, I had gotten my associate's degree at a community college, um, and then was traveling for a few years. And so by the time I made it back to college, I was a little bit older than everyone else. And, I was like working full time at a restaurant while I was going to classes. And so I didn't feel, I wasn't, I was excited to be back in school, but I also felt kind of separate from it. I wasn't quite sure like what I was there for. And there was this moment where I was taking these really intensive Japanese language courses, and then also taking this creative writing class with John Hennessy. And I really was so fascinated with both of them. And then it just got to this like fork in the road where it was like I couldn't make both work with my schedule. And it was like, which one am I going to pick? So I went with the creative writing.
Was it during this key period of discovering just how much you had to say on the page, and in your own unique way, we might add, that you began working on what became your first published work, the nonfiction Motorcycles I've Loved, a memoir, which Oprah.com raved was a rip-roaring memoir that traces her journey from a difficult breakup to a rebound affair with a series of motorcycles?
Well, with my first book, I had no intention of writing a memoir. Like that wasn't a goal or a thing that I even was envisioning, but I was writing these essays about motorcycles, which I was really fascinated with at the time. And I turned some into John, and he was like, this could be a book. And so that was how that happened. That's how I started conceiving of it in those terms. I had been riding for a couple of years at that point, and I was kind of my mother had been a motorcyclist as well as a younger woman. And I was in that way where you discover things about your parents later on, and it just kind of like reorients your gaze a little bit. You're like, oh, you were young once also, and are also a human being. Fascinating. So those things were happening at the same time for me. And I wanted to write about it. So that was the first essay that I did. And I was also struggling through a basic physics course at the time, which I found incredibly challenging on a math level because I had like dropped out of high school halfway through algebra. And so I was just like, this is so hard, but so interesting on a concept level to me. And I was just really wanting to be able to explore those ideas as opposed to equations. So that those are kind of the pieces that I was thinking about all at the same time, and they just sort of coalesced in this one essay. And I really liked it. And so I wrote another one with those three pieces, again, like some personal history, motorcycles, and the physics piece. And I think it was probably the second one where John picked up on those themes coming together and, could see them continuing.
How cool. What kinds of motorcycles were you racing down the road while writing this book?
There were a few. I guess the motorcycle I rode for the longest was a Triumph Bonneville, but that was after, the book came out, actually. That's what I bought with my advance. So before that, I started on a Rebel 250, and then I got a GL Interstate bike, also a Honda, and then I got a Magna, a 750 Magna, I think, and then the Triumph Bonneville. And then for a while, I was freelancing for Motorcyclist magazine, and that was really fun because it's like whatever bike you can dream of, they have in their garage. But that magazine folded a little while ago.
Now, this is going to sound really cliche in advance, but how do you feel like the writing affected the writing?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. It definitely affected the writing. I mean, how could it not? I think I wrote like the first half of the book while I was still in college, and I was waiting tables, and I was commuting to work and to school on my motorcycle. I'm living in rural Western Mass, so you have to like drive for 30 minutes to get anywhere. So I was spending a lot of time on two wheels, just like cruising through like farmland, basically. So that's pretty conducive to like rumination. And then after I graduated, I had like this sort of thesis, I guess, like a collection of essays that wasn't really a book yet, but I knew that I knew that I wanted to keep writing. And so I, did this big trip down to Florida on my motorcycle, which is part of the book. So I think taking that trip while I was thinking about the shape of a book was definitely impactful, probably on the story. I worked on it with my agent for about a year before we sold it. And so before that, I had probably been working on it for 2, maybe 3, somewhere around there.
Were you ever in any unique situations or scenarios that you first put yourself in because you then wanted to write about them?
That's a really great question. I don't think I was really being that intentional. Like, I think for me, the idea of writing, a memoir at all was not something I encountered until, frankly, I had an agent. Before that, I was like, this is a collection of essays, and there was some other stuff in there. And, I was just like thinking about my writing in a different form, or that piece of writing as a different form. In terms of publishing it, I had no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea like how that would feel to put that much of myself out into the world. And I didn't like that feeling that much. And so like if I would never write another memoir, I guess is where I'm getting to with it. And I'm like, we take the road that we take, and I'm happy that I wrote it and all of that. But it was like it's a complicated experience, I think.
That helps explain your brilliant turn into fiction next with Good Morning Midnight, which the Washington Post would celebrate as a beautifully written, sparse, post-apocalyptic novel that explores memory, loss, and identity, honing in on Brooks Dalton's exquisite exploration of relationships in extreme environments. To that end, please travel back in time with viewers, where you first conjured up astronomer Augustine, Iris, and of course, astronaut Sullivan.
This always felt like a novel to me. I'm not good at short stories. I can pull out an essay, but in terms of short stories, that's just never felt like my form. I was working at a public radio station in Massachusetts, and I was kind of like the office gopher. I was just like doing everything, answering the phone, sorting the mail, all the boring stuff. But I had, a sense of every department because of that. So I was kind of doing odd work for everybody. And Augustine is a character that came out of that time of just thinking about the engineering side of radio. It was like, I think during a particularly snowy winter, I just kind of had this flash of like, what would it be like to be alone in an environment like this? And that's where that started. So I started with Augustine. I wanted this person to be totally alone, totally in the dark. Like I was really into like pushing all those extremes. and was learning so much about radio engineering at the station, and just like figuring out what was possible. And I was experimenting with ham radio with my free time a lot, and just kind of getting the hang of that. So I started with Augustine, and the more I kind of thought about him and what kind of story could happen for him, the more I realized I can't just have, there has to be another half of this story. Like if you're going to write about isolation, you're also going to write about connection. And that's just kind of the way fiction works. If you pick one extreme, you have to bring in the other as well. And so then it became this really fun adventure of learning more about radio astronomy and thinking about this other kind of radio and wanting to put those together and trying to figure out what was actually feasible, like what could work. And it turns out it's super simple to use radio to communicate with people in space. It's like not that hard. People, like elementary schools do it all the time. It's tricky, right? When there's like, with Augustine, especially for a while, there's no one for him to really bounce off of. So it's just kind of this portrait of him on his own. And then Iris, the child that he finds, kind of comes into it. And that was her function as a writer. I was like, okay, I need there to be some kind of interaction here that I can work with. But, I think developing a character like that is both a function of what you need out of the plot, but also just like pulling in pieces of people you've known, experiences that you've had. I think a lot of my grandfather found its way into Augustine. And the more that happens, the richer it becomes and the more life they take on of their own. There wasn't really a muse for Sully. I think, initially I just knew that I needed her.
What's the balance between making a character imperfect but still likable?
The first thing that's coming to mind is that balance of giving them enough, but not too much. So you want them to be recognizable. Like this is the person that, left their child behind, that like had this unhappy marriage, that like you want to give them some meat, but you don't want to leave them looking like a caricature, like, oh, that's the grumpy one, that's the sleepy one, that's the sneezy one. Like you want to strike that balance of depth, but also, they're there to shepherd the story along. So, it's making me think of like when you see a movie and a supporting character just absolutely steals the scene and you're like, well, I want to watch that movie. Like that's the movie I wish I was watching. It's fun, but it's also not quite the effect that we want. Like we want the book that we're writing to be the book that you want to be reading, not the book that we chose not to write. So that's what comes to mind.
Did you have any other original working titles beside Good Morning Midnight?
I think I was calling it The Midnight Sun for a little while, and I knew I didn't love that because the title is both originally from an Emily Dickinson poem and then was used by Jean Rhys for her novel, Good Morning Midnight. And I'm not going to get it right, which I read first, but I was familiar with them both. And it's such a wonderful title. It was on my mind for a while. And I was like, can I do that? Is that allowed to steal someone else's title in this way? And I remember talking to my agent about it, and she was like, no, that's fair game for sure. But there was a little piece of me that felt like maybe it was overstepping. But in the end, I included a little epigraph from Jean Rhys's novel, which in a funny way, I think is dealing with a lot of similar themes in a super different way. Because in Jean Rhys's novel, she had included the Emily Dickinson poem as the epigraph. So it felt like this kind of nice leapfrogging moment.
What was that call like to get when word came Netflix was adapting it into a film that George Clooney was going to not only be starring in, but also directing, too, alongside an extraordinarily talented cast featuring Kaylin Springall as Iris and Felicity Jones as Sully, as this became the smash hit Midnight Sky that 72 million houses watched in its first week of release, and then hit Netflix's #1 spot in 77 countries around the world.
It was very surreal. I think with movie stuff, like a good rule of thumb is to not take it seriously until it's 100% happening. So, I was getting phone calls for a while that I was like, well, that's incredible, but I'll believe it when I see it. And then suddenly, I guess it was October 2019. I think that sounds right. The shooting was beginning and they were like, do you want to come? I was like, yes, I need a winter coat though. So it all happened, like it both was a cumulative piece of news, but also felt like it happened very suddenly. And yeah, it's hard to even really describe that one. It's the word I always come back to is extraordinary because it's just kind of beyond. It is like a complex experience, and not a lot of people, I think, really understand how complicated it can be. And no one ever wants to sound ungrateful for something incredible happening to your work. Like it's a gift. It's such a gift. But at the same time, it's tricky to like see something be taken in another direction that you would not have chosen. At the same time, I felt very, very welcomed by the crew. I visited set twice, and I am aware that that's not always the case. And so I was really grateful for that experience and that generosity. That was really special, especially getting to visit them in Iceland, where they were shooting the Arctic sections. It was like a landscape that I had spent so much time envisioning and imagining and had never been to, despite growing up in a very snowy climate. But like getting to stand on a glacier, there was this moment where we like rode out onto the glacier in these ridiculous vehicles, and they had set up this shot. And, they're like in this direction is George Clooney and like a bunch of stuff on the glacier. And behind us is just empty ice, like this expanse of white. And I just couldn't help but like keep turning around and like looking this way while they were shooting. So it was special on many levels to get to go there. That was a real treat, getting to see her work and getting to see the crew be so like tender and gentle with her, and just like making sure she got her homework done like between takes and stuff like that.
Now, we understand that the original inspiration for Light Pirate arrived to you during a writer's residency.
Good Morning Midnight had come out in August 2016. And right after that, I had two residencies lined up, and kind of coincidentally, they both happened in Florida. Not really a coincidence because I applied to them both, but I had applied to many, and the two that happened to say yes were both in Florida, which is also where my parents live. So I was suddenly spending way more time in Florida than I usually do, even though I, have these roots there. So I do visit a fair amount. And I think I was at the residency in Key West, at the studios of Key West is what it's called. And a hurricane was coming. And I was so taken with the ritual of preparation for that. The way that this community just like snapped into action. They were like, oh, we know what to do. We got to stock up on this. We got to tie this down. We got to put this away. And it was just like clockwork. And I was just kept thinking about that. I was actually there to work on something else, which I was really having a hard time with. And so I kept thinking about this idea of a community responding to not just one hurricane, but many, that sort of repetitive nature of it. And yeah, that's where it grew from.
What first gave you the idea to strategically plot the book in 4 parts: power, water, light, and time?
I definitely started with power, that section with the hurricane. And I knew from the beginning, I knew that I wanted the book to span a lifetime. I wanted the clock to be, one person's lifetime. And I think I remember I spent a long time on those first 100 pages. I think I spent like 2 to 3 years on that. Like it was, the rest of the book happened much more quickly, but I was really kind of struggling to figure out what I was doing, like what I was up to, what kind of book this was. And so I think ironing out that first section and then bringing in this voice of the hurricane, or this point of view that was unhuman, that had this sort of elemental quality to it, was when I started thinking, this is cool. And I don't want to just do this with the hurricane. And I also don't, like, this gaze can't really work for the entire book, but what else could? Like, what other elemental gaze could kind of step in and fill those shoes? So I think that started when I started thinking about it.
When you're building out an ensemble cast like the one readers get to know here in Kirby and Frida and Flip and Lucas and Wanda and others over the course of the story, do you tend to meet the characters one at a time or in groups? Say, take in the couple Frida and Kirby as an example.
They work piece by piece. I started with Frida. And I mean, I knew that her child was going to become kind of the main character, but I began with Frida, the mother, and then you add Kirby, then you add a son, then you're like, maybe another son. It's like this kind of cumulative thing. And the more characters you add, the more they start to bounce off each other. And in doing so, kind of reveal more of who they are and what they're up to. I think my favorite is Bird Dog, who doesn't really come in until later in the book. But, it's funny. I feel like, Florida has obviously had a few notable hurricanes this season. And I have been in touch with, my parents, obviously, making sure that they're okay. And it just dawned on me recently, like I finished this book, a year or two ago. I was like, oh my God, my parents are Frida and Kirby. Like, how did that happen? How did that make its way into the book? And I didn't even notice, like, the dread that my mother feels every time a hurricane is coming closer, and the sort of cavalier, like, I got this vibe that my dad has. It's totally the same.
They both must be very excited to see all that's happened for you over the past few years.
They liked it. It was fun for them, They're good folks. They're proud.
Out of curiosity, do they both ride motorcycles?
They do, actually, not currently. That's not the mood right now, but they both have in the past, for sure. Oh, I've ridden a fair amount with my dad, but at this point, my mom is like, I've done that. I'm good.
Do the three of you ever ride together as a family?
I don't have a motorcycle right now, but I still like to rent one every once in a while and like or borrow one and take a big trip. For me at the moment, living in Los Angeles, I'm kind of like, I don't want to ride in this. I don't want to commute. Like, I don't want to get from A to B on a motorcycle here. But I love a long distance trek. That's kind of what I like the best.
What's been inspiring you lately on the page that readers can look forward to getting their hands on next?
After The Light Pirate, The Light Pirate was a really taxing project to work on. It took me a number of years, like 5, I think, to do it, and to kind of return to this world day after day was just really sad and kind of weighed me down. And so when I finished that book, I felt very clear that I wanted to do something more fun. And so what I'm working on now is sort of a surreal fantasy. Um, and yeah, I don't want to get too into the weeds on it because I feel like it changes every time I look at it.
Can we look forward to seeing any more of your work being adapted to the TV or silver screen in the near future? And did seeing your imagination up in lights, so to speak, inspire you to give any screenwriting of your own a try?
I kind of, I wanted to be really thoughtful about what I did with the lights, the rights for the Light Pirate. And since all the movie stuff happened with Good Morning Midnight / The Midnight Sky, um, I've started to dabble in screenwriting more and have gotten some work out here doing that. And so it kind of became clear to me that I wanted to write it myself, or be in collaboration with someone else with it. So yeah, I'm working with a great production company right now, called Appian Way. And I think, we'll probably start pitching it soon, this take that we have. But yeah, I'm kind of moving slowly with it this time around. I don't feel the rush. I think there's this mood also when it's the first time that that kind of thing is happening, where it's like, oh, thank you so much for everything and anything that you're willing to bestow upon me, this measly writer. And it's not wrong, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, wait, this is mine. And I get to decide like what happens to it. And I'm not in a rush. So
Sounds like the best pace to write at. While you're working on a new novel, what are a few elements of your approach that you found to be successful that you'd share here with the aspiring author watching and hoping to be as successful in getting their own stories out onto the page?
I think the way I think about it is, I want to touch something every day. Like I want to touch it. I want to open it. I want to be in that document. If that's not the day that I write 2,000 words, that's okay. I mean, I love the days when I write 2,000 words. That's a good day. We all like that, but it can't be like that every day. I think for me, the thing that both cultivates momentum and allows space for like an unconscious process is to just keep it close in whatever way that means. So for me, that's just making sure that I'm spending a little time with it every day. Yeah. But, in terms of other advice, I think I'm a big fan of outlining, and I know that not all writers are. I think it's so interesting to hear writers talk about like, characters that just sort of tell them what the story is, and they are just there to write it all down. I love that for them, and I don't work that way. I like I need to spend time not only writing words that will go into a book, but also just like noodling around on yellow legal pads with like timing and pacing and characters and little scenes and just like how it's all going to fit together.
What about the importance of developing a good relationship with the editor at your publishing house?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I've had a different editor for every book, and not on purpose. My first editor left the industry, and my second editor left editing to write her own books, and we're still very close. But she's a full-time novelist now. So I'm on my third editor, and I have also been lucky enough to work with the same agent this entire time. So I think there's a way in which I think sometimes editors don't edit that much anymore. Sometimes they do, but sometimes agents step in and do a lot of that work. And so I think editors and editing is very important.
But it sounds like landing with the right agent beyond simply selling books is equally important.
Yeah, I think there are other ways to fill those shoes in your writing life. And even if you don't have an agent, like I think if you just have a really um, important first reader, or like, I think there are different ways to bring that sort of perspective into your writing life. So for me, that has been the most consistent person has been my agent. Whatever reader you can find that can be a reliable resource is, and that is aligned with what you're trying to do, is that's where it's at.
Lily, it has been illuminating. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you so much. I loved it.